Good morning, everyone. Actually, it's now good afternoon. We are delighted to welcome you to the Arthur Ross Gallery online, 12 at 12 today. I'm Lynn Marsden Atlas, Executive Director, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to 12 at 12 and also to introduce Lara Yeager-Crasselt. Lara is the curator of the Leiden collection in New York City and a specialist of 17th century Dutch and Flemish art. She earned her BA from Vassar College and her PhD in art history from the University of Maryland. At the Leiden collection, she oversees scholarly research and exhibitions, including the collection's recent global exhibition tour in China, Russia, and the United Arab Emirates. And in 2020, she became the co-editor of the Leiden collection catalog. Thank you, Lara, for joining us today. And we are thrilled to have you yet again speak about this beautiful collection. Those of you that have not seen the exhibition continues through July 25th. Please come to the gallery, make reserve tickets online, and enjoy this really exceptional and exquisite exhibition. Now I'm turning it over to Lara.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you so much. And welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today on our last event for An Inner World, which, as Lynn mentioned, is open for a few more weeks. So if you haven't had a chance to get down to Philadelphia to see it, please do. So the exhibition explores the idea of the inner world, of inner spaces, of contemplation, of reflection, of quiet exchanges, amongst figures, drawing us into the scholarly, but also the private spaces. And today, what I'd like to explore with Gabriel Metsu's painting of a public notary, which is in the exhibition, is that threshold between the inner and the outer world in this fascinating painting by Metsu. So let's dive right in. Gabriel Metsu's sober but kind-looking notary meets our gaze as he extends a large folio of papers and seals towards the viewer. Wearing a deep red jacket, he leans out of a stone window ledge, his solid body creating a silhouette against the darkness of the space behind him. He has a long graying beard and a distinctive face. His left eye slightly droops, and the wrinkles around his eyes and on his forehead bespeak his aging years. The large, smooth bricks that compose the window frame and facade around him bear the trappings of his profession. A piece of paper, its words illegible, is stuck to the upper right side of the window frame. Nails beneath it suggest papers or signs that have long been removed. And most prominently, in the lower left corner of the composition, hangs a wooden sign that reads Openbaar Notaris in Dutch, or Public Notary, and a date which reads 1650, probably 1653 or so, as we'll come to explore within Metsu's career. Metsu's notary resides at the juncture of an inner and an outer world, seemingly emerging from his space into ours. He demands our attention, but also advertises his wares. The two-dimensionality of the painting's surface seems to be punctuated by our encounter with an open window, the wooden shutter pulled to the side. We only even catch a glimpse of it. At this threshold, we have the meeting of our reality and the painted space. In this way, Public Notary is as much about Metsu's own command of painterly illusionism as the subject matter of the Public Notary himself. With his broad, loose brushstrokes, Metsu conveys the smoothness of the stones, the grain of the wooden shutter, the deep folds of the man's red jacket, and the worn pages of the notary's folio. As the light enters from the upper left, it leaves highlights on the notary's knuckles as he gestures to the words on the page, pointing to something, calling our attention. Again, we enter into a kind of dialogue with him. Metsu prompts the viewer to contemplate, to consider, question the scene before him. Do we actually affirm the notary's presence? To gain a better understanding of Metsu's painting, we need to take a step back and consider some of the broader artistic and cultural contexts that would have impacted his approach to the subject matter. Metsu painted this work as a relatively young artist, around 24 years old, in his native city of Leiden. Born there in 1629, Metsu began his career and had his initial training in Leiden before moving to Amsterdam, with likely an intermezzo in the city of Utrecht in the early 1650s. In 1654, Metsu had settled in Amsterdam and had his mature career in the city. The Public Notary occupies that moment when the artist, still working in Leiden, turned to what we'll see is more of a scholarly subject and an inventive glimpse into this subject matter. Although Metsu's master in Leiden has not been definitively identified, it has long been thought that he trained, at least for a time, with Gerrit Douw, then a renowned painter in Leiden and the so-called founder of the Leiden School of Fine Painters, or Fijnschilders, who created small-scale works executed with meticulous brushstrokes and a great attention to detail. And I want to show you here two of the works by Douw, which are in the Inner World exhibition from slightly later, the 1640s, when Douw began to develop this niche motif, and he continued for several decades. You have a painting from the Clark Art Institute, Douw's Girl at a Window, where we see the kitchen maid leaning out into our space, the light falling seemingly from within the viewer's reality. And again, later, 1671, Douw's Old Woman at a Window with a Candlelight, where he introduces the nocturnal scene and artificial light into this niche motif. Whether or not Metsu had been a pupil of Douw, he was certainly impacted by the Leiden artist. When Douw began to experiment with this niche motif in the 1640s, depicting figures leaning out of stone window ledges, as we see here, engaged in various activities, he had a careful attention to the painterly illusionism which this pictorial motif presented. Around 1650, Douw painted this work of a young man, which was long thought to be a self-portrait of the artist, leaning out of a stone window ledge, smoking a pipe. A green curtain has been pulled to the side to reveal the scene. An open book is displayed on the ledge before him, beneath which is tacked a piece of paper curling at the edges with the artist's signature. Metsu's Public Notary reflects a familiarity with Douw's pictorial invention. In fact, this painting is Metsu's first use of the window ledge motif. Moreover, like Douw, Metsu seems to have been particularly interested in depicting different textures and the effects of light, such as the open pages of the book, the folding pages of the text before us, and pushing the limits of the deception at play. Unlike Douw, however, Metsu's choice of subject matter in this niche painting significantly changes the dynamics of its representation. Unlike the smoker in Douw's work at right, or even other self-portraits of the artist, Metsu's notary is a figure with a distinctly public function. In the 17th century Netherlands, a notary was responsible for keeping lists, making inventories, keeping track of people and things. His seal signified authenticity. It was an official marker of record. By replacing Douw's signature, as we see at right, with the notary's sign in the same position below the window ledge, here now writing on a piece of wood rather than on a piece of paper, Metsu's painting becomes cleverly self-reflexive. It seems to bear witness to itself and the artist's own powers of artistic illusionism. Metsu's interest in the subject of the public notary extended to at least one other painting, also from about 1653, a notary sharpening his pen. In this work, Metsu brings us into the notary's inner world, his private space, that of his study, where he sits engaged in the activities on the desk before him, an open folio, stacked books, seals displayed prominently before us, an inkwell, and a stick of red sealing wax. The figures in both paintings are most certainly the same model: the distinctive face, the slightly drooping eye, the thick beard. But whether these works would have been considered pendants is unlikely. Although their measurements are nearly identical, the oval, fictive painted oval frame around the painting on the right, the sketchier quality to its execution suggests that it was another effort on the part of Metsu to explore the subject matter. But whether or not these works would have been considered pendants in any way, and unfortunately we know very little about the early provenance of the Leiden collection painting, their depiction, the juxtaposition of the inner and outer worlds of the notary's activity, the public and the private, demonstrate Metsu's continued engagement with this subject matter. Interestingly, Metsu's portrayal of a public notary departed from iconographic tradition, often portrayed as a foolish figure, one to be doubted. Here instead, he bears the trappings of a scholar. He appears as a kind of dignified individual, whether engaged in his intellectual tasks, the public function of keeping records. He has the beard and the demeanor of someone of serious intellectual activity. And in this way, Metsu's notary bears considering in the context of Leiden. The city was home to the Dutch Republic's oldest university, which had been founded there in 1575. By the time that Metsu was working as an artist in the mid-17th century, Leiden had already long been a major intellectual center in Northern Europe. It was also a major publishing center, one then of words, of books, of papers. Dow was also interested in depicting scholars at work. In these two examples from the Leiden collection, scholar interrupted at his writing and scholar sharpening his quill at right, show bearded figures in fur-trimmed coats engaged deeply in the activities before them. The figure on the left, right, has paused from writing. We, the viewer, not unlike in Metsu's Public Notary, have come to interrupt them. Metsu's Public Notary may bear the trappings of the scholarly profession, influenced not only by Dow's niche motif, but also the scholarly intellectual world that he would have encountered in Leiden. And at about the same time, Metsu pursued another subject, but one which has an interesting relationship to the notary. The monumental Woman Reading by a Window, a work which is also in the exhibition at the Arthur Ross Gallery, depicts a female scholar dressed in an antique-styled robe, wearing a large feathered beret, paused from reading a large folio propped up against the open window before her. This moment of interrupted thought, of interrupted action, seems to be something that Metsu pursued and explored shortly before he left this university city for Amsterdam. In the Public Notary, books, papers, words, the materiality associated with the scholarly tradition must have fascinated Metsu during his years in Leiden. The Public Notary belongs to this moment of the artist's career as he joined the inner and outer worlds to create a sensitive and engaging portrayal of a figure at a threshold, fulfilling his public function, but also engaging directly with the viewer and asking us too to participate in this moment of illusionism. And I just want to show you as well where this painting hangs in the current exhibition, just in another quick moment here. this grouping of this exploration of the niche motif by Dao. You see the Clark painting on the left, obviously the notary at center, and Dominicus Fontole, who was another pupil of Dao, here at right. This becomes a motif that is really popularized and continues for decades after Dao really develops it. And we see Metsu here exploring it in these various ways, just to give you a glimpse into one view of the gallery, of this inner world that Metsu and Dao and their contemporaries in Leiden created. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lara, so much for this fascinating talk. And I think that Suzanne is going to handle any questions and answers that people have, or questions to you, Lara, that are coming from the chat.
So there are no questions right now in the chat, but it is 12 at 12. Hi, this is Suzanne. I'm speaking as the Arthur Ross Gallery. It is the 12 at 12 custom that we usually are meeting in person. Of course, we haven't done that for quite some time. So please do feel free if you have a question directly for Lara. You're welcome to unmute and ask your question as you might in the virtual world as you might in real life as well. But please feel free to type into the chat. And until then, I do have a question, Lara. A couple of people have spoken throughout the exhibition about figures, similar to the figure that you're speaking of, this kind of character or this type of person or somebody who's playing a specific role, and that person being that kind of positionality kind of shifting in this period. And I just didn't know if you could speak to that a little bit more. It really seems like the 17th century was a time, especially in relationship to things like the public and the private or the academic. Things were under contestation. What is academic? Who is an academic versus, and maybe I'm using the wrong terminology, versus who is a person of the public. And it's just interesting. I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about that and the role that these artists played and the positions that they took in trying to, support different figures or, malign different figures in that way.
That's a great question. It's a huge question as well. And I think this is 17th century is a fascinating moment for that, really defining these spaces, shaping these spaces of public and private. And I think, just to kind of also bring it back to some of the ideas explored in the exhibition, that the idea of what is a private space and a public space, there's a lot of overlap in this period in a very literal way. And I think artists could sort of transcend these spaces in various ways. So, one example actually is in the space of the home, right? That we consider, our homes are sort of personal private spaces. But in this period, often the ground floor of a home could be a shop, right? It could be a kind of public space where business was conducted. This is also a place where paintings were hung, as they were hung also in private spaces of the house. So just to kind of, come back to focus some of your question on this idea of public and private, and how, in fact, a painting like Metsu's, I think, must have hung somewhere, maybe just beyond the very private space of someone's home, or even if it perhaps hung in a town hall or a more public space, we just don't know. But Metsu had very prominent patrons in Leiden and then in Amsterdam. And there's been, suggestion, was this figure actually a notary himself? And was he creating kind of portrait in a way? I don't necessarily think that's the case. But the very idea that Metsu portrayed a public notary, leaning out of a window ledge like that, to use that motif by Dao, I think gives us some insight into how an artist was thinking about considering these different spaces and what they meant, how people interacted and what function someone like a notary would have had. So I don't know if that answers your question a little bit, Suzanne, but.
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry. I know it's a big question, but we had a couple other people speak about different types of figures similar to notaries. So I found that really interesting about your talk.
I do see that Heather has a question here in the chat. Just say, based on your talk today, I'm really noticing the contrast between the way that Metsu portrayed the sitter's eyes. Yeah, it's really fascinating. The notary in the exhibition features such a piercing gaze. Can you comment on this comparison between gazes and perhaps more generally in the gaze amongst other Metsu's works? I think it's fascinating the way that Metsu portrayed this figure. And I think it had to have been a model that he worked from life and really wanted to capture his individuality. You get a sense not only physically, but even something of his sort of personality through that gaze. And it's a powerful way that artists could not only portray figures, but to connect with the viewer, to really engage the viewer in a kind of relationship with the subject matter, with the figure. And this painting is somewhat unusual in the directness of the gaze that the notary has with the viewer. And if thinking about the large painting by Metsu of a woman reading a book by a window, right? She's not looking at us, but there's a real power and intention behind her gaze. And I think that idea of intentionality behind it makes for a more powerful painting and allows you to really connect with the subject matter. Metsu goes on then to Amsterdam, as I mentioned, and he begins to really focus on genre paintings of elegant figures in interior spaces, dressed very beautifully. And it's a different kind of subject matter. But you do see, in fact, another work in the Leiden collection of a woman writing a letter that she's stopped to gaze directly, turn and gaze directly at the viewer. So it's a kind of, maybe even call it a kind of motif of Metsu, that the gaze becomes part of the painting's story itself, actually. Thank you.
Thank you, Lara. If we don't have any more questions, we will let people go back to their days, but please, thank you, Lara, for your scholarship, for your wisdom, and for sharing such a broad cross-section of the Leiden collection's works in illustrating Metsu's paintings today. I really appreciate that. I got to see some more treasures, so that was wonderful.
Thank you. Yes, please go visit the exhibition and just spend some time with these paintings, spend some time with the Public Notary.
Exactly. They're there for contemplation and beauty and enjoyment, and they're really exceptional works of art. So thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at the Arthur Ross Gallery. And again, thank you so much, Lara,
for
this wonderful talk today. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.